Bugonia is the latest film from Yorgos Lanthimos, and in classic Lanthimos fashion, it is super weird, and I liked it a lot.
Greetings. Welcome to the headquarters of the human resistance.
Yorgos has been on a bit of a tear lately, making a lot of movies, most notably Poor Things, with several Oscar nominations and even some wins. Kinds of Kindness after that, which wasn't quite as good. And now Begonia, which is a very solid entry into his filmography. Without going into too much detail about the plot, the film follows Jesse Plemons' character Teddy and his cousin Dawn, kind of two, you could say, conspiracy theorists who believe that Earth is being infiltrated by an alien or aliens, and it's their duty to essentially rescue Earth. And of course, their target in the film, the alien that they're after, is a powerful corporate executive played by Emma Stone. It's, I would say, a loose reimagining of the 2003 Korean film Save the Green Planet, not exactly a straight remake. That Korean film kind of flopped when it was released, but over the past couple decades, it has been reappraised and now sits firmly in the Korean cinema canon. And the remake idea kind of passed through a few hands. There was this notion that perhaps an American remake could be successful. It ended up with Ari Aster, who connected with Will Tracy. Tracy was one of the lead writers on Succession, and Tracy ended up writing the screenplay that ultimately made its way to Yorgos, who of course added his own perspective to the film. Interestingly, Yorgos had never actually seen the original, so he approached it with a very fresh, unique lens. The team shot this film on VistaVision, which is very much in the middle of a small kind of renaissance at the moment. You've seen it in films like The Brutalist, for example. It creates very unique images, but it isn't a super friendly camera to work with. Some of the kits can weigh like over 200 pounds, and it makes a ton of noise. So the camera was kind of abandoned for many years until we developed ways in post-production to really be able to eliminate that sound. Previously, it was very difficult to actually sync the sound because the camera itself was so loud. There's some other unique quirks to this kind of camera as well. You load the film horizontally and it's prone to getting jammed, which I guess happened a few times on set, particularly early on in shooting. Still, the director of photography, Robbie Ryan, and Yorgos were confident that they could make it work, and they did. They made a lot of interesting visual choices here, actually. One of them that they consistently came back to was this idea of short sighting. You hear it a lot with like documentary style filmmaking and talking head footage, where short sighting basically you're flipping traditional advice on its head. Rather than framing the speaker toward the area with open space, you instead place the character, the subject, in the middle or even nudge them towards this tighter edge. And that sort of imbalance kind of portrays a sense of unease, even if you don't necessarily have the vocabulary to articulate what is off. The average viewer kind of sees or feels that something isn't quite as it should. And by using this kind of short-sighting technique through certain pieces of dialogue instead of traditional framing or even over-the-shoulder shooting, this technique kind of keeps these conversations increasingly uneasy. We see it with Jesse Plemons' character Teddy chatting with Emma Stone's character Michelle Fuller, and also with the exchanges with his cousin Dawn, played by Aidan Delbis. These scenes are already tense, but by framing them in this way, it limits the quote-unquote breathing room even more and makes things even more uncomfortable. Another choice that goes against the traditional film school playbook shows up when we're at Teddy's place. The windows in the background behind the kitchen are blown out. They're overexposed. We are losing some details in the highlights, and normally, again, If you're doing everything by the book, you expose for the brightest part of your image first, so you make sure that the windows are exposed properly, but Yorgos doesn't like to flood his set with artificial light. He likes to really lean in on this natural light, and so the DP was reticent to bring in a bunch of additional lights, and as a result of that, some of the highlights are clipped in the windows. And this is a really good example of this idea of function over style, ultimately in support of the story. This blown out look we see only in Teddy's home, and it more or less mirrors the mess, the disarray that he has been living in. If these shots were perfectly exposed, it might actually not fit as well with the moment. So, again, sometimes you can break rules as long as you know why you're doing it. Something else that stands out about Yorgos's work is his reliance on low angle shots. And low angle shots are not uncommon in filmmaking, obviously, but normally you see them in more medium or close up shots of a character, traditionally to make that character look more imposing or powerful because we're literally looking up at them. Yorgos does do that sometimes, for sure, but he approaches it differently, as is often the case with Yorgos. He uses these low angles on a lot of wide shots, and that's something that you don't see as often. So by dropping the camera lower in those particular shots, he isn't really making a specific subject look powerful, but again, it is a technique to make the audience feel uneasy. When the camera sits at a normal eye level, everything tends to feel natural and comfortable to us. But when you bring that camera down closer to the floor on a wide shot, suddenly the scene just feels a bit off. And again, it's just another subtle technique to use the camera to push you towards discomfort without you maybe necessarily even realizing why. Something else that they do from a visual perspective in Bugonia is play a lot with lines and symmetry. Early on, we have Emma Stone's character, Michelle Fuller, and you have these very clean, parallel lines. Everything is upright, everything is straight, everything is tidy. It gives us a sense that this is a very organized world. But then when we're alone with Teddy, these vertical lines aren't perfectly vertical, and not everything meets neatly, and not everything is creating a perfect frame. And again, this just mirrors his own life, and it is disorganized. It isn't perfect. There's one really clear example, but I mean, there's several throughout the film, is when Teddy is biking and we see these power lines, and all of the lines are just slightly crooked. Everything is just a little bit off. We also see this sort of juxtaposition early on in the film when we're watching Michelle's character, and we have these gorgeous open wides around her home, and then this is contrasted with Teddy's basement, and we have a lot of very compact shots, and the camera is still, it's locked off. Yorgos kind of has, I wouldn't say a rule, but if you watch enough of his work, it's something that you pick up on, is he believes that if a character is moving, then the camera should be moving, but if a character is still, then the camera should be still. So early on, when we have a little bit more frenetic energy, the camera is moving a lot. But when we're down in the basement, which kind of reads as like a chamber piece at times, Yorgos and his DP, Robbie Ryan, tend to lock off the camera on a tripod. And these basement scenes, despite or maybe because of their stillness, end up being some of the most powerful in the film. And something that makes these scenes even more powerful is the fact that production essentially built an actual house. They built this whole basement. The original plan was to potentially shoot on a soundstage, but again, Yorgos likes to keep things as real as possible, and they were able to, with this budget, build a house, a real kind of lived in feeling that brought these scenes to life. As far as the themes in Begonia go, Yorgos is always looking at trauma. That is something that is consistent through a lot of his work, and Begonia in particular looks at some of the ways that people try to cope with trauma, ways that aren't particularly healthy. He also explores echo chambers, and that's something, again, that he has touched on before in projects like Dogtooth, for example. But in Bugonia, it's filtered through this modern age, through the internet, and how this digital era can kind of reinforce those bubbles, so to speak. Beyond that, there's interesting questions about communication and language, how people might actually share parts of their worldview, but they can't seem to connect. There's still this distance, there's this lack or this difficulty in communicating. And then, kind of an ongoing metaphor is this idea of colony collapse disorder, which is something that has been observed in bees. And Jesse Plemons' character Teddy is a beekeeper. And so Yorgos plays with this idea of colony collapse as it might potentially relate to human civilization. When it comes to the ending of the film, it is definitely polarizing. It's not going to work for everyone, and that shouldn't be surprising if you know Yorgos. A little bit of spoiler territory here. I'll try not to go into like too much detail or really give anything away, but for me, the ending worked. I needed to frame it in a certain way for it to work. To me, it works best as a projection of Teddy, this kind of idea that the story needed to end this way. There was only one way that the story could end for Teddy because of how far they came. And on top of the ending in general, the like final sequence I find very, very beautiful. We get an interesting glimpse into humanity, the beautiful and the ugly. And at the end of the day, this is a solid picture in the Yorgos Lanthimos catalog. It's not his best film of all time, but it is a couple levels above Kinds of Kindness. Thank you so much for watching. Watch the next video and the next one and the next one too, and like, comment, subscribe, hype it up if you're watching on a mobile device. Yeah, and have a wonderful day. Cheers.